Welcome to another illuminating episode of Great Karate Myths, Debunking the Legends. Today we're excited to welcome Matt Turner, a seasoned martial arts instructor and long-time member of the Kata group. In today's discussion, we tackle a fundamental concept that's often misunderstood. Are kata truly perfect? We'll explore the inherent limitations of kata, why a focus on spontaneous improvisation is more crucial than prescribed scenarios, and how the historical and cultural origins of these forms reveal their true purpose, which often involves weapon deployment, not just unarmed combat. If you ever wondered about the practical application and true depth of kata, stick around. Let's start with Matt. Greetings, Matt.
Greetings. Yeah, thank you very much. I guess in our brief discussion, we sort of discerned that I've been part of the Kodo group for at least over 20 years. My background in martial arts is varied. I started at the age of 7 with Wadaryu, which is common theme, I think. When I was 7, so yeah, I've done other things along the way, particularly classical Japanese weapons arts as well. Some Aikido and other bits and pieces, some Kung Fu. So yeah, a long-time investment and a long-time member of the Kodo group, which has been a staple for probably a quarter of a century or so.
Excellent. Thanks, Matt. Okay, let's get into our discussion today. Tom, do you want to open?
Yeah.
Kata are not perfect.
Kata are not perfect, yeah. Yeah. It's a couple of things, really. It's about the limitations of kata and how much content is useful. So I was having a conversation with someone yesterday, and they asked me if I thought that Zanshin, for example, was the basic method, and Seisan and Sanseiryu were a backup plan or a plan B if the Zanshin goes wrong. And I sort of said in response, no. And because I don't think there's anything prescribed in the kata. I don't think that there are scenarios or if something goes wrong, you do this or anything like that. And I think that the kata have a limited amount of content. And the idea is that you don't have too much so that you can still be spontaneous with it. So you have a map of the territory. You have you have your fundamental system of the set of martial skills, and the idea is that you would be able to improvise with that as you engage or whatever. It's not scenario based choreography and having a fallback plan or anything like that. And I think it as I was chatting with the friend, we talked about how much would be useful. So if you take we've talked about Kusanku a lot, so I'll just use that as an example, which is disarming a bow. How much information is going to be useful to you, and how much is going to keep you within that threshold of being able to improvise and be spontaneous and not start to create an artificial process whereby you kind of get stuck in overload with having too many techniques or too many conflicting ideas or something like that. And I don't think that kata should have all the answers either. So the idea kata are not perfect is that it's not the answer to every single question or possibility or problem that someone's going to encounter. That's what improvisation would are. That's, being spontaneous and improvising as problems arise is the order of the day, I think, in terms of these martial skills and martial systems. And I don't think we should expect kata to have the answer to every problem or everything like that. They're fundamental methods, they're maps of the territory, and you can explore and improvise in any, within those sets of skills. So, yeah.
Nathan, do you want to jump in your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah.
This is a rhetorical question. But is it or is it not the case? Well, let's take it first. There are myriad kata, many kata. I can go through the styles, but we've done that in previous podcasts. So we could say there are sort of in modern karate, there are 50 kata plus, 50 kata and growing, not including homemade styles that create kata. Is it or is it not the case that, and would I be wrong to suggest, would I be wrong here, that kata grow in number as people record all of the different possibilities that could occur in self-defense? Is that correct thinking?
It's making things too prescriptive. If you've got too much, it's that point again about being too prescriptive with things and trying to control something that really is almost impossible to control, which is how an altercation is going to unfold or unravel, or thinking that you could have a backup plan. It suggests that you could in some way predict what's going to happen. And I think that there are sets of ideas about how, if you do things in a particular way, you could predict what happens next. And I don't think that's the case, especially when it comes to violence and fighting. And so when things become too prescriptive, you have too much information, too many techniques, you start to, it takes away that ability to improvise. It takes that ability to respond as things arise in the melee or what, whatever.
And we've covered much of this before, but it's interesting to note, and you're quite right. But you can imagine a Westerner sitting down to think, how do these kata occur? How do they make them? How do they design them? Look at the linear thinking processes that are used that are not decrying left brain linear thinking. That might look at the problem of creating kata. Well, okay, we're going to look at, for instance, things that people do regularly. There's one teacher and author who lists these as habitual acts of violence, and his thesis describes kata as being responses to habitual acts of violence people do regularly, habitually. And his idea is that that is the cornerstone or the key for how kata were originally created and how they should be viewed. And I know this particular author and senior martial artist. We've had our discussions, but sufficient to say I don't completely agree with that on the grounds that how do you set how can you be sure that your habitual acts of violence are ubiquitous, universal, across cultures, across the board? And clearly they're not. So we've said before that we do have to look at culture and context and history. And so the island of Okinawa, for example, would be a completely different environment and culture from that of a city in England, London, or Liverpool, or Manchester, or Coventry, or Birmingham. And the idea that we can just tailor these, particularly antique kata, tailor these in some cases quite ancient kata that possibly stem from Ming Dynasty China, or give that a date. At the end of that was 1644-45. But suddenly the patterns that were passed on from that time period should fit an altercation in a nightclub, or at the entrance to a nightclub or a pub, or in 2025. That's quite a big ask. And the point is, if you look at the left brain way of approaching this and how a Westerner might think, how would we go about this? Well, we've got to look out for a right punch. So I'll do blocks and counters on both sides. And that seems to be what the kata are indicating, that we should be able to perform all of these defenses
and counters on both sides. So that's how that kata is structured. So somebody hits you with the right, you raise a block, and then you counter with the right, and then you repeat on the other side, and so on. And then the person closes the range down, and so you use an elbow for close range, and so on. And that's a completely mistaken idea as to how the kata unfolded. And as we've said, repeatedly throughout our podcast, for a start, a lot of the kata that we're examining are deploy weapons. If they're not deploying weapons, so and we're not forever stuck to Sanjin and Seisan and Sanseryu, but if they're not deploying weapons, as Tom has capably illustrated, or will be illustrating on film, I'm told, will show that they are countered to weapons, disarming someone from a bow, or retaining the grip of your own bow, stopping and pinning with thigh, preempting in civil arrest situations. These are not static scenarios, block and counter. They can't be further from that. So I think effectively, the idea that they need to be perfect, as we discussed in previous podcasts, is a nonsense. We can't make something to cover every eventuality. It would be like sitting down and deciding in the morning before you walked out the door in some sort of paranoid fashion, I'm going to sit down and think of everything that could go wrong today, and then I'm going to write down what could go wrong and what I could do to defend against it or solve that, whatever. So I'm not going to walk out the door because something might happen. I'm going to be prepared. I'm going to consider every threat or danger and I'm going to write it down. And I'm going to write down that that's not the way that the kata were created at all. That's not the mindset that created them. And it's timely now to repeat that in order for those structures to exist, generally speaking, and quite frequently, we have to step away from the idea that these are patterns to go against unarmed, spontaneous attacks in a self-defense, particularly in an urban self-defense situation, because they're not. The way that creates not only the embu, the floor plan, the direction of movement, but also the hand positions, the arm positions, right, actually centered around either the use of or going against a weapon, which limits the range of movement into patterns that can be somewhat predicted and benched and turned into a fallback. And that's completely different from trying to come up with a perfect self-defense for anything that might happen to me, to one, should one be randomly attacked.
Yeah, I think it's very noticeable actually that when the weapons or use of weapons is taken out as a context and people try to apply these antique forms in a fisticuffs sort of fashion, they by and large they have to abandon the actual form and the way that the movements. I saw a video just the other day of somebody trying to apply the first few techniques of Naihanchi Shodan, and I mean his application of it bore absolutely no resemblance to the actual Naihanchi form. So that really does speak to the idea that if you take it out of its proper context and its proper use, you've got to get creative with even the actual structure of the form, which is obviously well, why bother with the form then? Why bother practicing it correctly?
A cynical view here is kata a currency? Almost the creative interpretation and the application is currency.
Well, if you keep making up applications, which anyone can do, you can keep those seminars busy for years, can't you?
Well, it's not just the seminars; it's views now, clicks and views and subscription.
Sure. Yeah. but it brings into question really how long should a professional using these arts, so somebody that was trained in the civil arrest skills or any of the different systems that we've talked about, how long would their professional training be, and what would the maintenance be? It's not going to be 20 or 30 years, and it's a kind of martial arts myth, isn't it? It's a karate myth. You've got to apprentice yourself to someone for 40 years, and it's all a load of rubbish. Because it's easy to say that if you say, well, there's always more to learn, and you could keep it going forever because you could keep making it up, couldn't you? It just goes on ad nauseum, really. And actually, these kata, how to function, and once you've learned it, you've learned it. There's no like, well, is there anything else? Well, no, this is it. You've read the manual. You've trained it. You've used it. How many more times do you want to keep going? There's ways of improving, and I think that the ways of improving come from the feedback from real experience or experience with resisting training partners, which is how someone might develop their personal practice. But the collecting of more and more and more, I think you're exactly right, Shani. I think it is a form of currency, isn't it?
Well, I'd like to have a go at qualifying that, if I may. You used the perfect term, pretty much, Shani, in saying that kata are currency. They became currency. So if we look at the creation of Goju-ryu karate, which is very much the brainchild and the creation of Miyagi Chojun sensei, as late as 1910, because Miyagi, I'll shorten it to just Miyagi sensei. Miyagi sensei was a conscript in the Japanese. He found himself a conscript in the Japanese army. Much to his chagrin, I'm not sure he was mad about that, but he wrote to various people while he was on service. And one of them, he wrote to Kyoto Juhatsu, his senior under Higashiyama, and lamenting the fact that Kyoto Juhatsu had begun to learn the sanseryu, allegedly. And Miyagi was a bit miffed of, and these are written records. He had, up to that point, only learned 2 kata, Sanchin and Seisan. So back at the ranch, his senior was busy being taught the 3rd kata, and kata were a premium then. And it's quite interesting to know that the parallel system, which personally, it's my belief that I think we share the belief as a group that the kata actually originated from a common source in Fuzhou, but it doesn't. Notwithstanding that, Miyagi Sensei only knew 2 kata by 1910. Bearing in mind that it was in 1917 that he created the Tensho kata. And if you look at the Kyoto Juhatsu, he actually only learned 3 kata from Higashiyama Sensei. 3 kata: Sanchin, Seisan, Sanseryu. Now it's quite interesting that, meanwhile, back at the ranch, so let's go on. Let's look at what Funikoshi Sensei was learning for 10 years. Oh yes, Naihanshin 1, Naihanshin 2, and Naihanshin 3. By his own material he recorded himself, he spent 10 years on the Naihanshin series. 10 years. But it seems to me that in order to make karate more, quote, progressive and more to attract more students, I think kata, and back to Shanir's term, were a currency, stable currency. And it's, in fact, with respect to the style of Goju-ryu, there were not the set 12 kata creating this style, as far as I'm aware, and virtually until at the end of Miyagi Sensei's death, until the end of his life, or in fact after his death, when his senior students, who'd only been taught 3 kata apiece,
collectivized these kata, put them together, and created and made a system out of it of like some 12 kata. So early practitioners did not know 12 kata plus, 12 in Goju-ryu, 15 in Wadaru, 27 and growing in Shotoken, or Storu. Storu collects everyone's kata and has no disrespect to Storu. They're hedging their bets. They do all of the Goju kata and all of the Shorin-ryu kata, and they do some 50 plus kata, plus some very obscure Chinese kata that they seem to have added in the last 30 or 40 years. My point is that they did, in fact, these kata did, in fact, become currency. Well chosen word. But that is it's a false trail, because it assumes that these kata are all independent standalone kata. And in some respects, they can be. And so in the case of Tom's understanding of Kusanku, which I embrace, it's a particular function to do with a staff. But then, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, but so is possibly the Pasai or the Chinto. I've got to get these the right way around. One's tonfa and one is retaining your bow. So forgive my failing memory. But the actual styles, the sequences, Sanchin, Seizan, Sanseiryu, the Nai Hanshin series, generally they're not really a collection of kata. The Nai Hanshin series is one kata broken into 3 parts, and I think that the Weichi, the Sanchin, Seizan, and Sanseiryu is similarly one kata broken into 3 modular parts for teaching, and I'd extend that to the Wing Chun. Not my original idea. It was Yip Man's own son, Yip Chun, that told me, private conversation in my own home, that he suspected that the Wing Chun form Z, plural, may well have been one complete form originally. I completely agree with that. And I think same is true for Sanchin, Seizan, and Sanseiryu. The same for the Naihanshin series. And similarly, the Kusanku, Chinto, and Pasai also will be related for similar reasons, although those 3 should not be lumped together.
I was just thinking, it reminds me of it's a bit like mysticism, isn't it? Keep everybody enthralled and in awe and mystified of the master who knows everything, and actually he doesn't. He doesn't know everything. It's quite funny, actually. But you're right. I think he's right. Currency. It's a currency. Yeah, I agree.
Just jumping back quickly to kata not being perfect, and I think it's worth mentioning that there's this assumption, which I've encountered across the board, that the information in a kata is any good in the first place. So just because we know what the functions are, or we've researched, or we're ongoing work rather, doesn't mean that they're any good in the first place. So you can have a kata like Goju Shiho, which is tonfa, or Weichi Sanchin and Seizan that are sai. But it doesn't necessarily, just because they are that, doesn't mean that they are particularly good methods in the first place. That's something else. That's something else to be explored and to look at, whether Kusanku is a good method of disarming the bow. Is it one that could be effective, or is it just been made up with someone that sort of fancied having a go at that in the first, and there's plenty of that in the world. There's plenty of kata that have been made up. Even people from our own group have made up their own forms. Just because the kata exists doesn't mean that they're high quality in the first place. And so that there's that element of kata not being perfect. We shouldn't assume that it's all superb, high quality, top-notch stuff. It could be an absolute pile of horse shit. And so we need to kind of consider how pragmatic these skills are when we're researching them and looking at them.
Could I just clarify a point, Tom? Nobody that's active in our group creates kata, because that's a no for us.
No,
I think you're referring to an individual.
In the past, sorry, yeah.
complained with us that the particular individual and decided that he knew better and he could create Kata. So he created an entire named it and created his own Kata. That's not something that ever happens within our group. We not one of us creates I've always bulked it that all of us have of creating a Kata, and there's enough to search through and tidy up and understand as it is without making confusion, making more particularly wrong things as this individual, in my view, did.
Just thinking about the Coda Kata, really, it just strikes me that what we have is a framework of, if you like, I don't like the word techniques, but I use the word techniques, but they are actually applied in the pushing hands, and you can apply them as they are in the kata. Which is quite a lot different to most other practices. I would say I can't think of any other group actually that does that.
No, and I think we're quite clear. We are quite clear on saying that they are creative interpretations. As far as Sanchin and Rokushu go.
Rokushu, yeah.
But they're creative interpretations of a creative interpretation.
Yeah. But they actually you can actually apply them in the pushing hands as they are in the kata.
Right. Yeah.
Which is completely different. It's completely different to what you'd encounter anywhere else. So, yeah, I thought I'd just see our phrases there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think very rarely that you get anyone saying, yes, I've just made this up.
No.
I think that's an important point, though, because something that came up in my conversation yesterday with Nikolai, our friend in Denmark, was that you have all these applications being made up, all this creative interpretation of the antique kata taking place, but what's generally omitted as they publish their information or discuss it is that they made it up. And that I said to yesterday that if you make a statement about an antique kata, or you suggest a movement could be this, you're making a statement about the function, you're making a statement about the context, and you're making a statement about what the intended function of it was for. And so that's, and if you've made that up, I think it's important to state that. I don't think there's anything wrong with the creative interpretation. I think it's got its place and it's got its use, but in terms of the antique forms, I think all roads eventually lead to the what were these forms originally for, and being honest about, well, I'm just making up some applications because I quite fancy it to be self-defense. That's what I want it to be for, and so on and so on. But yeah, that point is what you essentially, when you got the kind of the bunkai specialists, if you like, they never say, well, these are the ones I've made up this season. Stay tuned for season 27 next year, where I'm back on the seminar circuit with,
and we're back on the currency again.
Yeah.
Oh, I can remember my Lao Gar days, and when I was about 14. Oh God, some of those forms they did was just like, what the heck are they? What? They're really elaborate and interesting. I never ever saw any of the material used in sparring or anything like that. It's just total crap. Yeah, it's just nonsense.
If I can shift sideways for a second, because I was considering yesterday, a very popular YouTuber who had a thumbnail sort of claiming that the kata, the karate kata, Seishan is the oldest kata, ? I'd like to address the question mark, unless anyone else wants to.
Yeah.
First of all, what do we mean by Seishan? When Morio Higona Sensei, and he is a very well, and I'm not talking about him actually, he is the really well-renowned Goju instructor, and really did power Goju karate forward the world. His contribution to the BBC, English BBC Way of the Warrior series, in which he featured, had an episode. He went to China to try to find the roots of Goju karate. He couldn't find the roots. He could find many forms with the same names as the forms that he had in Goju-ryu, the ones that he had learned. So he could find the names, but he could not find the same kata. Sure, everybody had a sanchin, and then guess what? So many of the systems had a seisan and a sanseryu. Interestingly, he could not find the seipai, the kororumfa. He could not find basically the Goju kata in the Goju anywhere in China, anywhere he was looking. I don't mean to imply that they're not there just because he couldn't find them, but I get the impression he was quite thorough. And the reality is that there are the names of those kata have many different forms, type. It's quite difficult to compare the Fujiao Seisan with the Goju Seisan and compare that with the Sozuken Hangetsu or the Waru Seishan. So the pronunciations are very common. Whether it's Seishan in Waru or Seishan in Goju or Hangetsu. They're very nuanced. They've changed. They have been altered to fit the format of the style in which they're being reflected. Then, if you try and compare that with various Chinese forms, you get a problem. We all, like our group, but collectively, we are of the opinion that the Weiqi field is incredibly accurate, and Weiqi sanchin is the gold standard. That is absolutely the gold standard. Tom and I have had, and all of us amongst ourselves, a number of conversations about this, in which I asked Tom whether he, several occasions, and we've had protracted discussions about this, whether he thought that the monk list that my dear friend Simon Laley was good enough to show me when he got so turn in China. I got early exposure to it, and our group got very early exposure to the Hapoen, the Bavulian, and the writer Pat McCarthy demonstrated David Dissini, and he was in England, and we spent some time together. It was very interesting to see, at an early stage, those forms. But Tom and I, after a considerable amount of study and practice and conversation, I asked Tom quite bluntly, do you think that the Weiqi is more accurate? It's like the word pure, but I use it, more pure. And Tom, I think the response was pretty much yes. Undoubtedly, I think we got as far as to say our joint view is that the Reiki Seisan, going out on a limb here, but likely predates a lot of the other versions, because it shows that connection, a very clear connection to the Reiki Sanchin. Now that could be argued in the case of Doji. Digress for a second here and say that rings to the Goju karate appear very late and have no parallels in China. none whatsoever. So really Trojan senses kata do not occur in the Toron-ru, the creation of Oda Jihatsu, the most senior student of Mr. Tokugaku's Higashiyama Tenro. In other words, the style created by Miyagi Tetsui's senior, Toron-ru, only taught Sanchin, Seizan, Sanseiryu. Later, he did keep the fourth kata, which escapes me now. But effectively, there were none of the kata that you find that are found that are found in Goju-ru in Toron-ru. Those kata don't exist. In fact, they only exist in Goju-ru. Crazy though, their namesakes do exist in China and can be found in Chinese forms, but most of those forms hardly resemble. Well, they don't resemble them at all, except they have a beginning, a middle, and don't resemble them. It is our collective opinion that the Seishan kata is not a standalone kata. It's not. You can't just pick it out. And it's interesting that the Naha kata, that would be the Goju and the Weichi and all of the derivatives, do not have standalone kata. Whereas the Kusanku, it seems to me, and Tom's the best one to elaborate on this, but the Kusanku, the Chinto, the Pasai, can be standalone. We have their specific departments, unlike the Weichi series or the Wing Chun. The Wing Chun, for instance, have a common theme right the way through. There is no common theme and my Hanshin. And that's quite important. So my point was there cannot be a standalone Seishan kata coming from the Naha tradition. And by the time it finds its way into the proof and Shotokan, which is a broad-based amalgam of kata, in which the functions of being dissipated or not being known, and that's no disrespect to Shotokan. I've already expressed my admiration for the quality of their karate, according to their own view of what karate is. No disrespect to them, but they do not. They have a highly eclectic combination of kata, in which where Seishan has become Hangetsu, and this is not a clear transmission. And I repeat, I repeat that the Seishan is not a standalone kata. It's part of a trilogy. It means Hanshin before it and probably Sanseiryu after it.
Okay, Matt, any thoughts?
Well, I just had a small devil's advocate question, actually. So if returning to the theme of the kata not being perfect, Sanchin of the Weichiryu series is foundational. It's the gold standard. I can well anticipate the question coming. Well, why the other two? If the Sanchin is the gold standard for manipulating the sai and the basic technique with the sai, why are the two sequential forms, the Seisan and the Sanseiryu, why are they necessary, and why do they seem more elaborate?
Well, I think to answer that, the Sanchin is how to read a map, and the Seisan and Sanseiryu are your maps. And that's it. And as I sort of said at the beginning, you don't want too much more than that. There's more than enough in the Seisan and Sanseiryu to give you an effective system of sai usage and not diminish the ability to improvise and be spontaneous. And also there's that question of, is it a good method of using the site? Is it an effective method? Because that's not also an assumption that we wouldn't make. And so there's that exploring, can we be effective with it? Would it be, is it the best method ever of using the site? Who knows? But it's a method. And it's certainly almost undoubtedly not perfect. Use a double negative there, sorry.
Put another layer of analogy on top of yours, and what came to my mind was that expansion are like the basic rules of a language. So, because English is my only language, we've all struggled with French when we've been in that work with other places. But the point is, the analogy I want to make is, Sanchin is like alphabet and creation of an alphabet, but built into that alphabet are the punctuation marks that would be used in the construction of sentences, paragraphs. So Sanchin would lay that down in my analogy. They would lay that down, and then Daishan would be short story writing or essay writing. It would be an example of how you would write an essay, and so they're commentaries. And Sanserio are commentaries, development of the theme of the structure of alphabet, spelling, grammar, and punctuation. Sorry, I haven't done the best with this analogy. I think that Seisan is grammar and syntax. That's better. And then Sanserio could be seen as an essay. So they're just developments. But if you don't have letters, you can't. How can you write anything? So first you have the building block, and that's what Sanchin is. And the other two kata are developments of that theme. Will show the practitioner how to write. But that's not, if you think about it, every book in the English language is made up of 26 letters. Well, that's quite incredible. Millions and millions of words. I don't know how many books there are in the world. Nobody does. All made from letters. That's quite incredible. So we could see that Sanchin as the alphabet. And then we could see the following kata, the following two kata, as how to express that developments of the theme heading towards literature. What that's understood perfectly right. It needs the rest of it needs to be done in the mix, spontaneously, in application. In other words, like you go to school, you learn the alphabet, you learn how to write a paragraph, then you learn how to write an essay, and voila, you can write as many novels or history books or science books as you're capable of writing.
So what comes to mind there is a point that has been well made on the podcast and well made in your book, Nathan, that the collection of wide arrays of kata really only serve to confuse. You simply don't need that many. The three Weichi kata are enough. And as Tom said, whether they're good enough is a different question, but certainly you don't need more than that. You don't need to create 10 new sai kata, because you've got everything that you need in those three, and adding more and more and more serves only to confuse and probably detract from the ability to use them spontaneously. You create a lot of confusion for your body. You want to be able to program certain movements, certain ways of using the sai. And what you don't want to do is add endless numbers of kata on top of that to try and account for every possible scenario, every what if, because you'll never be able to do all of that spontaneously.
Yeah. May I ask you? Oh, go ahead, Tom.
No, you go ahead.
I just wanted to ask Matt. It's a bit not an easy it's I don't want to send you a curveball, but here it comes. What was the view on kata when training in kenjutsu or in swords in Iaido? Sorry.
Well, that's that's interesting actually, because the Japanese weapon systems, as I've practiced them, they do have a lot of kata. They do have a lot of set kata where A does a technique and B responds. And then, almost ad nauseum, you have kata after kata after kata. And so actually I can sort of sympathize with the question of, well, how do you deal with this and how do you deal with that? Because they seem there's lots and lots of these kata all put together. None of them spontaneous, by the way. They're all completely choreographed with set pieces. So I can, of course, that's all sort of in the format of a duel, and everyone knows what everyone's doing, and the objective is the performance of it. Really, I never witnessed anybody pick up a bokken or and have somebody else pick up a bow or a jo or anything and free play. Never saw that happen. And I don't mean to detract from the practitioners. I met some very, very skilled people within that remit, but I honestly never met anybody that I thought would last very long if it was just an open free sparring situation. And of course that's, it's widely not possible really, because you're dealing with, although you're dealing with wooden weapons, by and large they still do a lot of damage. You don't want a concussion or broken bones, but it's all contained within those fixed choreographed kata, and that's probably a mentality that's it still permeates a lot of attempts at applying kata. I mean, it's a different ball game when it comes to the karate. What do we call it? Well, the bunkai, the whole bunkai currency. Yeah, sorry, Nathan, I don't know if that satisfies your curveball question.
I think it raises a good question as well, that how do you get from choreographed set pieces to spontaneity? How does that lead to that? And I don't think it does. And I think it does connect with the bunkai, because what we're seeing more and more of now are two-man set pieces. So they go through a kata. You see this on seminars now where you learn a bunkai sequence that covers the whole kata. So that much like that you see in the kenjutsu or the jodo, or and so on and so on, and these long set pieces, and how does that lead to spontaneity? I've never heard a good case that doing set pieces over and over again leads to spontaneity and the ability to improvise. And I don't think you see that in the antique kata. I don't think that they are set pieces, with the exception of Naihanshin, but that's a different conversation. But in terms of the Weiqi, the forms preserved in the Weiqi, or the Shorin-ryu forms preserved in Shorin-ryu, what they teach is not something that is to be organized in a set piece, a long piece of choreography, with the idea that it could somehow become spontaneous. It's something that's supposed to be able to exist within spontaneity, not create it.
Couldn't agree more, Tom. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
One doesn't lead to the other. And in fact, that's an assumption that's made, and also something that is used by teachers to prop up their styles. And again, no disrespect to any styles or any teachers, but I always said to Crennington, we were quite good friends years ago. He was a water instructor, quite senior, I think, and I asked him the pair done in modern, and I'm not again attacking a style, just looking at the thinking or examining the practice. The Waterloo has very distinctive pairs work, which is admirable in one respect. But the problem I had with it when I came across it was the pairs work bore firstly no resemblance to the kata, which then threw further open further questions as to, well, here are these pairs work, but they're not like the kata. So we've got the pairs work, we've got basics. Why do we need the kata? It just further alienated the kata, because the pairs work, whilst they bore, you could stretch it a bit and think, well, it looks a bit like the kata, but not really. But, they were quite distinctive.
That's that rings that sounds similar to what you were speaking about on our last podcast about the Wing Chun, where you were saying that the forms that they weren't contained in the pairs work. You couldn't see it.
Yeah, spent 3 years trying to. Yeah. Tried 23 of us. We spent, like Tom with his 3 years, we tried to do the Kushenku with a sai. We spent a lot of time trying to. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe the thinking was wrong, but my assumption was that here are the forms. Here's the sticking hand. Should we not be able to put all of the forms, the techniques from the forms? Maybe no. Maybe that's shallow thinking. Maybe some of the techniques are designed to be used on the gap, on a distance, but the whole Wing Chun genre, the whole practice is done close quarters. I couldn't find anything really seriously long distance. In Wing Chun, it was not a long distance style. It was close quarters. Everything was close quarters, and the ethos was you need to express everything through the pushing hands. Never managed to do it. Never saw anyone that did, and still haven't to date.
I think when Matt and we used to train in Jodo together, the Japanese short star that would go against a sword, we would do these long pieces of choreography and, try and add a little bit of extra spice into it by sort of going as quick and as hard as we could with it. And, it felt effective within the choreography. But when I think back, I don't think I could have been spontaneous or improvised with it. I mean, didn't do it for that long. I wasn't that good at it. But what we did do, I never felt that could lead to that ability to improvise. And even with the Wing Chun Nation, because you could produce, even if you could produce those forms in the sticking hands, would that necessarily lead to spontaneity or the ability to apply it in a fight? And all it's just, I think it's a similar thing.
Well, yes, I hats off to your modesty, Tom. But Matt, you both competed at quite high levels, as far as I understand.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. International competitions, yeah. But those competitions, those taikai are, of course, they're based on the performance of those set pieces, and that's largely how it goes. The competitions are based on the performative idea of those set pieces. And Tom, you're absolutely right. It doesn't lead to being able to use these things spontaneously. Far from. People get very good. They're very, technically very, very good at performing these set pieces over and over again. But spontaneous, it isn't. It's all within very, very defined parameters.
I think that choreography is also instills something that might work against an individual if they thought they were going to go and fight with it. The idea of an exchange or backwards and forwards is not an idea I necessarily want to internalize for a fight or a combative situation.
No.
We talked about it a lot. Going first is crucial, and keep going until the job's done is the idea of if I'm going to exchange with someone. I think that's really problematic, especially with weapons.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, we did come to that conclusion a number of years ago that the Joe staff, you could well use it as a weapon against a swordsman, but not reactively.
Yeah.
Not reactively, because the second that blade comes out of the scabbard, you're done, because that's one of the most devastating cutting weapons that humanity has created. And you've got a 4-foot long wooden staff. No, I mean, you've got to go first. You've got to get in, and you've got to prevent that swordsman from drawing that sword. And it's the same principle with the sai, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've got to be proactive. You've got to go first. You've got to read the situation very, very quickly and know what it is that you need to do to prevent escalation. Otherwise, it's a very much an open game, and you're likely to lose.
I think that's why there isn't a space for a plan B, because if you know what you've got to do, and if you haven't achieved it, then I don't think there's space for plan B. I think you realize you're in deep shit if you haven't got the job done. And again, it speaks to these skills aren't perfect. If they're applied well, you can do the job. You can, these different martial systems in these kata. If they're done well, and but you're not going to win every time. There's no guarantees. It doesn't produce perfect skill. It doesn't produce perfect outcomes. And those are kind of assumptions that creep in. Well, I've got these really good bunkai. If someone grabs me from behind, or grabs my wrist or my lapel, or throws a right hook, I've got it made because I've got my. It's not necessarily true. Even if you could predict those things to some degree effectively, it doesn't mean that the outcome's is implied by the technical content.
Well, Matt, you said something about the manner of what ifs.
Yeah.
Is it natural to reach out or grab for a weapon, or the hand holding the weapon?
No, I mean, I'm sorry to be fairly blunt, but no, I don't think so. I think that rather underplays natural instinctive reactions of getting out of there. I don't think it's a natural thing to grab for a weapon controlling hand. I don't see that that's a natural progression in an exchange. You probably probably be more inclined to try and disengage and get away, just out of sheer self-preservation. I could be wrong.
I think that was off the back of someone suggesting that if the sai techniques didn't work, that somebody could grab the sai or twist it out of. Could it be, what would you do then? And I think it was descending into the what ifs, and then and I think those are questions that the kata. I don't think they're not part of the kata. It's not part of the method. Things will go wrong. But it's wanting some sort of reassurance, isn't it? That if I do this, everything's going to be okay, and it's going to work, and I'll be effective. And that's, kata are not perfect, and it's just not true. But we were also talking about people that would have used these skills were being trained professionals. And that probably meant that there'd be elite athletes, there'd be equivalent of elite athletes. We're not talking about recreational practitioners that train 2 hours a week. We're talking about people whose job it was to employ the sai, or to be a palace guard or a bodyguard or to be a mercenary or part of a militia. That would have been their whole life, would have been the use and application of these weapons and tools and the physicality that comes with it. So I don't think it's to be judged on a recreational level. It's about how much would a professional have been training, how fit they would have been, how strong they would have been. If you took the kind of top crop of the UFC and gave them these skills, I imagine they'd be pretty devastating in those particular roles. Because they're elite athletes, they're highly capable. They can fight already. It's not that they learn these martial skills and they can suddenly fight. They can, they're natural born fighters. They can do it already. And you add some skills in and God, they're devastating, absolutely devastating. Or you add a system for a particular role, for a particular context. So yeah, I think that's an important part of it that is essential for these martial systems.
Nathan, last 2 minutes.
Well, they're well ground. They're either police or militia, and they're professionals. Yeah, they're not people training in a centrally heated dojo in comfort and warmth. Like twice a week. Not the same thing at all. Yeah, that's a grew out of the myriad of professional necessity. As distinct, I would re-emphasize from previous podcasts, as distinct from warfare, which is a different matter altogether. But think militia and police professionals.
That's why Kata are not perfect.
Hello there, Tom. 6-word summary.
All right.
And that wraps up our compelling discussion on why kata are not perfect, with insights into the historical context and practical limitations of kata. Today, we've learned that kata are foundational tools, maps of martial skills, rather than prescriptive, all-encompassing guides for every possible confrontation. The emphasis should be on improvisation and understanding their original contexts, often involving weapons. If this discussion resonated with you, please subscribe to our podcast, visit our website for additional resources, and join our community on social media to continue the conversation. Your support helps us keep debunking those legends.